The wind off the Tetons could peel bark from a lodgepole. In winter it found every crack in a man's cabin, every gap in his hide coat. Ephraim Holt had spent 6 seasons trapping beaver on the Green River, and he'd learned that a man's worst enemy wasn't the Blackfeet, nor the grizzlies, but cold that chewed through bone and split the very logs that sheltered him. That's what set him thinking on his contraption. Holt wasn't the kind of mountain man who bragged around a rendezvous fire. He was a thinker, slow-spoken, the sort that whittled while others drank. Larpenteur once wrote that such men carried the sense of the workshop into the wilderness, and Holt fit that breed. Years earlier he had apprenticed to a gunsmith back in Independence, Missouri. When he came west with Smith's company in '26, he brought along a habit of tinkering with iron and brass. The Popo-Agie Valley had been kind that fall, full traps, good sign, easy trade with the Shoshone. But by December, trouble rode the wind. Bands of Blackfeet were ranging south, and every lone cabin on the streams looked like a storehouse to them. One night a neighbor's place went up in flame, dry pine, pitchy and bright. The next morning Holt rode over and found nothing but char and smoke. The man had been lucky to crawl out alive. That sight lit something in Holt. If a man can't hold his home against fire or foe, he told himself, then he's not settled. He's squattin' on borrowed earth. He started sketching in charcoal on the inside of his cabin door, a habit he'd picked up from reading Jedediah Smith's maps. He drew levers, vents, pipes, and a chimney cowl that turned like a weather vane. The idea was simple. Make a cabin that the wind couldn't set ablaze, nor smoke out, nor freeze. Using scrap iron from busted traps and a length of wagon tire, he forged a double-walled stove. The inner chamber burned small and hot. The outer shell trapped the heat and pushed it down through a system of clay-lined channels under the floor. Larpenteur's journals mentioned traders building crude Russian stoves at Fort Union. Holt's design took that frontier notion and gave it mountain sense. He laid flat stones for a foundation, plastered them with mud and ashes, and set his stove in the center of the one-room cabin. Then he built an air vent through the north wall with a bear grease flap that shut tight in storm weather. The vent drew in cold air low and sent it past the firebox, feeding the flame without robbing the room of warmth. When he fired it up the first time, the smoke didn't billow. It hissed up the pipe clean and straight, even as a blizzard howled outside. Holt grinned through his beard. "By thunder," he muttered, "she draws like a preacher on Sunday." Word of the strange stove spread quick. Trappers wintering near Horse Creek came to see it. One old hand, called Bear Track Jim, tried to melt a pot of snow on the stovetop and burned his mitts. "Holt," he said, "you've built the devil's belly in a box." But the proof came later. Mid-January, a band of Blackfeet tried to smoke him out. They piled brush against the downwind wall and lit it. The storm that night fanned the flames but drove the smoke right back on them. Inside, Holt's vent system kept the cabin's air clean. Sparks never caught. The outer logs stayed damp from snowmelt drawn by the stove's underground heat channels. By dawn, the raiders were gone, coughing their lungs raw. Holt stepped outside and found his roof steaming, not burning. From that day, men around the rendezvous started calling it the Untouchable cabin. Some swore it was witchcraft, others said it was plain smithing sense. Kit Carson, passing through 2 years later, supposedly took sketches of the design. Whether he ever built one himself, no one knows. What Holt proved was that ingenuity could live as hard as any trapper. The mountains tested, more than a man's back, they tested his wits. When the Museum of the Mountain Man later displayed replicas of frontier stoves, one note mentioned a trapper's cabin on the Popo-Agie with an early form of heat exchange flue. That was Holt's doing. Though his name had faded to legend by then, he left little behind but the iron stove itself. Larpenteur's trade ledger lists a Holt E trading one iron contrivance for powder and lead at Fort Union, 1,834. After that, his trail goes cold in the Yellowstone country. Some said he went north with Beckworth's party, others that he married into the Crows and taught them to forge kettle lids that hissed like wind through pine. But the cabin stood for 20 years, long after the beaver were trapped out and the rendezvous ended. Travelers found it half buried in aspen leaves, Stove still intact, the vents clear. They said when a man lit a twig inside, the smoke climbed straight for heaven, no matter how the wind blew. By February, the Popo Agi Valley had locked itself in ice. The river didn't flow so much as creek, like leather under strain. Snow lay to a horse's belly, and the sun stayed low enough that even noon carried a shadow's chill. Ephraim Holt's cabin stood against that pale light, like a scar on the hill, a place no man but him would have chosen for wintering. He was proud of his untouchable cabin, but solitude had its teeth. Out here, a man heard too much of his own breathing. The stove whispered, the timbers settled, and sometimes the wind itself seemed to mutter through the vent as if talking back. It was the third night of the new moon when Holt first heard the scratching. Soft at first, like a tree branch caught in a drift, then harder persistent, something testing the latch. He set down the awl he'd been using to mend a moccasin and reached for his rifle. He opened the door quick, the way a man does when he doesn't want to give fear time to argue. The night looked like powdered ink, no moon, no horizon, just snow breathing out mist. Nothing moved, but he saw prints in the drift, not man's, nor bear's, but wolf, big ones. 3 sets, maybe more, circling the cabin. He'd tangled with wolves before. Most times they kept to their packs and scavenged. But hunger made beasts bold, and this winter had been lean. He threw on his coat, grabbed a torch, and circled the cabin. The wolves had dug near his meat cache, dragging at the stones. When the torch flared, he caught their eyes green coins winking from the brush. He fired once to scare them. The shot echoed down the frozen valley, and the eyes vanished. But before he shut the door, he heard it again. That dry rattle of the latch, as if something had learned the sound it needed to make. The next morning, Holt found claw marks on the door frame, right where the latch string hung inside. He cursed softly. Well, I'll be damned. They're learning faster than most men. It wasn't so far-fetched. Beckworth once told of wolves in the big horns that figured how to pull down a hanging venison strip with their teeth, then pass it along to the pack. Holt remembered that story now and didn't laugh at it anymore. He set about reinforcing the door. From a broken sled runner he fashioned an iron hook that dropped into a socket on the jamb. He spliced the latch string short and pulled it in tight through a drilled hole so no paw could reach it. Then, because a mountain man's best tool is imagination, he rigged his stove flue to run a narrow iron pipe beneath the threshold. The heat from his crazy invention now seeped under the door and melted away any ice that might freeze it shut. That night, the wind carried the wolves' howls from far off. They weren't afraid anymore. They were patient. For 3 days they came and went. Holt saw their tracks every dawn, closer each time. He lost a pack mule that had wandered too far from the corral, found only bones and a twisted lead rope. By the 5th day, he stopped going out at all. He had meat and fuel enough. What he didn't have was company except the wolves. They gathered at dusk, their shapes ghosting through the trees. He could hear them pacing, panting, waiting. He'd sit by the stove, whittling, listening to the muffled thump of paws on snow. Every so often one would leap at the door, just to hear the latch rattle. It became a kind of siege man against hunger on 4 legs. On the 7th night, the storm broke. Wind screamed through the canyons like something alive. Holt stoked his stove high and listened to the roof groan. Then came the sound again, the latch, click, click, deliberate. The fire popped, sending sparks up the flue. He grabbed his rifle, eased to the door, and waited. When the latch moved again, he swung it open wide. Snow whipped in. A wolf lunged gray, tall as his chest, muzzle frosted white. It hit the iron threshold, and in that instant Holt saw his own genius at work. The pipe beneath the door glowed faint red. The heat burst the wolf's paws with a hiss of steam. It yelped, twisted mid-air, and vanished back into the dark. For a moment Holt just stood there, breathing hard. Then he laughed a dry, half-crazy sound that had been waiting months to get out. "Untouchable, eh?" he muttered. Maybe for man and beast alike. By morning, the pack had gone. He found blood in the snow and the faint drag of something limping east. The door's iron still held heat from the stove. He knelt, touched it, and thought about the line between cunning and cruelty. In these mountains, he reckoned, that line was as thin as a rabbit's whisker. 2 weeks later, when the snow softened to crust and the first ravens returned, Holt spotted fresh tracks, boot prints this time. A single traveler, coming from the north. He watched from his doorway as the figure appeared, lean, frostbitten, beard rimed white. The man raised a hand. "Trapper sign?" he called weakly. Holt nodded and waved him in. The stranger was half-starved, said he'd come from Fort Hall after his partner froze in Snake Country. Name was Silas McKee, a Scotsman by birth, quiet as Holt, but with an eye that measured every detail. He admired the stove, the venting, the way no smoke leaked. "That's a clever box," he said. "You ought to patent it, if such a thing reached this far west." "Patent?" Holt grinned. "Out here, a man's patent is his rifle. Keeps others from claimin' what's his." McKee stayed on through the thaw, helping mend traps and haul pelts to the Green River rendezvous come June. But he never stopped sketching Holt's stove, tracing every pipe and joint like a man memorizing scripture. When they parted, McKee promised, "I'll tell the traders at Fort Union what you've built. Might fetch a fine trade." Holt just shrugged. "Let 'em talk. The mountain'll take back what it wants, stove and all." That spring, beaver were still good, but Holt found himself caring less about pelts and more about what could be built in this wilderness. The wolves had taught him something. They'd learned the door latch. He'd learned that invention never stopped at a single victory. Every gain in the mountains demanded another. Years later, when Larpenteur wrote of a heated threshold cabin near the Popo Aggie, he credited the design to 1H Elt, a lone trapper of mechanical turn. Scholars argued whether it was real or apocryphal, but men who wintered that valley said when the snow came hard and the wolves howled near, you could still see the cabin's chimney sending up a straight thread of smoke, clean, unbent, untouchable. And if you listened close, some claimed, you might even hear the faint click of a latch that no beast ever mastered again. By May, the snow was gone from the low ground, though the peaks still carried it like old scars. Ephraim Holt broke camp early that year. His traps were light beaver were thinning, but his pack mule carried something heavier than fur, a bundle of iron plates, stove parts, and sketches scrawled on tanned hide. He was bound for the Green River rendezvous, the wild trading fair that drew mountain men, Indians, and traders from every trail in the West. It was more than a market, it was the beating heart of the frontier. Men came to swap pelts, brag stories, and buy the civilization they swore they'd left behind. For Holt, this trip meant something else. Word had spread about his untouchable cabin. Trappers called him the man who beat fire and frost in the same breath. Some wanted to see the invention that made him legend, others wanted to buy it or steal it. He had no illusions about what fame was worth in a land where men killed over a musket cap. The trail to Green River followed the old Shoshone path through the Wind River Range. Holt traveled light but steady, one mule for gear, one for the stove, and his rifle across his knees. Nights he camped under spruce, the air smelling of thaw and pine pitch. He'd melt snow for coffee and trace his finger along the drawings of his invention. The more he studied it, the more he saw how simple it really was, a thing born of necessity, not genius. A mountain man's contraption, he told himself, made from scraps and stubbornness. Still, something in him stirred when he thought of men using it, trappers, settlers, maybe whole families warmed through a Rocky Mountain winter because of an idea hammered out by a lonely fool with a forge and too much time. On the second week out, Holt met a small band of free trappers heading east, 2 Canadians and a young Delaware scout. They'd heard of him by name. "You the feller with the iron box stove?" asked one, a wiry Frenchman called Leclerc. "McKee tell it at Fort Union, said it keep out smoke and squaws both." Holt chuckled. "Keeps out smoke for sure. Squaws I can't swear to." The men laughed and shared whiskey. Around the fire that night, they traded tales of frozen rivers, busted traps, close scrapes with Blackfeet. Leclerc told one about a Crow chief who offered 50 ponies for a gun that never needed powder. Holt smiled. "If a man ever makes that," he said, "he'll own the mountains." The Delaware, young and quiet, studied Holt's stoveplates and finally said, "Iron heavy. You trade it?" Holt shook his head. "Not yet. "First I see what the traders offer." He didn't tell them the rest, that he wanted to see whether his invention belonged to the mountains at all, or if it was too clever for its own good. When Holt reached the rendezvous grounds near Horse Creek, it was already a roaring city of canvas, hides, and smoke. Hundreds of men crowded the valley: trappers, traders, Indians, gamblers, and women wrapped in bright blankets. There were wagons from Street, Louis, tents flying company flags, and the smell of tallow, whiskey, and horse sweat thick in the air. It was said you could find anything at a rendezvous, from a Bible to a barrel of rum, from a wedding to a knife fight before breakfast. Holt led his mules through the camp, drawing stairs. The iron stoveplates clanked with every step. A few men called out, "Hey, Iron Man, show us that magic firebox." He nodded but kept walking until he found a quiet spot near the traders' tents. Among them stood a familiar face, Silas McKee, the Scotsman who had wintered with him. McKee's clothes were cleaner now, his beard trimmed, but his eyes hadn't changed. They still measured everything. "Well, I'll be damned," Holt said. "Didn't expect to see you this side of spring." McKee grinned. "Told you I'd spread the word. The traders are keen on your invention. There's talk of outfitting company posts with iron stoves that use half the wood." "Talk's cheap," Holt said. "Iron ain't." That afternoon, McKee introduced Holt to a representative from the American Fur Company, a polished man named Hiram Gage, soft hands and sharp eyes. Gage inspected the stove parts as if they were gold nuggets. "Efficient design," he said, tapping the flue section. "We could cast these in bulk back east, a fortune in trade posts and settlements." Holt crossed his arms. "Ain't made for parlors or forts, made for cabins, for men who don't have time to fix what shouldn't break." Gage smiled thinly. "Every tool begins in the wilderness, Mr. Holt, but ends in civilization. That's progress." The words soured Holt's stomach. He'd seen what progress looked like: rivers fouled by camps, herds driven off, and tribes pushed farther into the mountains. Still, he couldn't deny the lure of trade, of finally having something more valuable than pelts. "What's your offer?" he asked. Gage named a sum more money than Holt had ever seen. Enough to buy land, maybe even build a forge of his own. McKee's eyes flicked toward him, urging, but Holt didn't answer. He just stared at the iron plates laid out before him, glinting in the sun like pieces of a life he wasn't sure he wanted to sell. That night, while the rendezvous roared with song and gunfire, Holt built a small fire beside the river and set up the stove. Men gathered around to watch, laughing and jeering. When the flue began to hum and the stove glowed warm without smoke, the jeers turned to silence. Gage himself stepped closer, eyes wide. "Remarkable," he whispered. "It burns cleaner than anything I've seen." Holt just nodded. "Built it to survive, not to sell." He reached into the flames, grabbed a piece of charred pine, and scrawled words in the dirt beside the stove. A man's invention should serve the land, not chain it. Then, before anyone could speak, he kicked over the fire. Sparks rose, hissed, and died in the river's dark. The traders shouted. McKee swore, but Holt didn't look back. He packed his rifle, left the stove cooling in the mud, and walked toward the timberline. By dawn, he was gone. Some said Holt went north toward the Yellowstone, where the Crow still hunted. Others swore he joined a wagon train east, chasing a quieter life. But those who knew the mountains best figured he just kept moving, same as the wind. Years later, a trapper found the remains of that iron stove on the banks of the green, rusted split, but still standing. And beside it, carved into a flat stone, were 3 words worn by rain and time: "Still untouchable always." Summer of '34 came dry and hard. The plains burned yellow before the solstice, and the Yellowstone ran low enough to show her ribs. Out there, where the land folds and sighs beneath the Absarokas, a man could disappear if he meant to. Ephraim Holt had done just that. He'd left the Green River rendezvous like a shadow leaving firelight, quiet, without farewell. He carried only what he could lash to a single mule: rifle, traps, a few pounds of powder, and 1 small iron pipe from his stove. Just a reminder, he told himself, that even a fool's work can keep him warm. By the time he reached the headwaters of the Yellowstone, weeks had passed without seeing another white man. The country opened before him in waves of sage and stone, and the nights hummed with wolf song. He'd built himself a brush shelter near a stand of cottonwoods, setting his fire low, so the smoke wound through branches like a ghost afraid to be seen. It was Crow country, he knew that well enough. Beckworth's stories told of the Crow as proud traders, quick to smile but quicker to judge a trespasser. Holt had trapped alongside a few of them years before. He'd shared tobacco and stories, mended a rifle or two. He hoped that counted for something now. One evening, as the sunset bled into the horizon, 3 riders appeared from the north. They came silent, like brush shadows that decided to walk. The lead rider was old, his hair braided with copper wire and crow feathers. He lifted his hand in peace, palm out. Holt did the same. They dismounted a stone's throw away. The old man spoke first in Crow, slow and careful. Holt caught enough to piece together. "You are the iron firemaker. We have heard your smoke." Word traveled faster than rivers in the mountains. Holt wasn't surprised. "I'm just a trapper," he said, tapping his chest. "Ephraim Holt. I make a fire that stays where it's put. Nothing more." The Crow elder smiled, his teeth bright as river stones. "Fire that stays where it's put," he repeated. "That is power." They stayed the night by his fire. The elder's name was Chief Red Elk, and his 2 companions were sons. They brought dried meat, traded stories of buffalo hunts and raids, and listened while Holt explained his stove, the air vent, the heat under the floor, the way it refused to smoke. When he finished, Red Elk said, "My people freeze in lodges when the wind screams. We burn all night, and still the smoke blinds us. You make fire that warms and does not choke. That is good medicine." Holt shook his head. "Ain't medicine, just iron and sense." Red Elk's eyes gleamed. "Then give that sense to my people. Teach my smiths. We have tools, trade iron, strong hands. We will pay." The offer tempted Holt more than gold. He'd never thought of himself as a teacher, but something in the chief's words stirred him the idea that his contraption might ease more than his own loneliness. He agreed to stay a while. The Crow smithy wasn't a forge in the white man's sense, just a pit lined with stone and fanned by hide bellows, but the men who worked it knew iron like a second language. Holt showed them how to shape plates thin without cracking, how to join flues with clay mortar to seal against smoke. They worked for days, sweat streaking soot across their faces. When the first stove stood complete, a squat, boxy thing of hammered plates, Holt felt something he hadn't in years, pride without pridefulness. Red Elk's people gathered to see it burn. When it drew clean and the lodge filled with warmth instead of haze, a cheer rose that echoed across the cottonwoods. From that day, they called it the Sleeping Fire. Holt stayed through autumn, helping build 3 more stoves. In return, the Crow shared food, hides, and a peace Holt hadn't known since leaving Missouri. He learned their words for things: Ashe for fire, Issa for friend. Sometimes he'd look out over the plains at dusk and think maybe, just maybe, the mountain had finally let him belong. But peace doesn't last long where iron's involved. When traders from Fort Union passed through in October, they carried news and greed in equal measure. They spoke of a white trapper teaching Indians to build iron furnaces, and Hiram Gage, the company man Holt had spurned, had put a bounty on the design. Property of the American Fur Company, they claimed. $500 to any man who brought Holt east, alive or dead. That night, Red Elk found Holt sitting by the fire, jaw tight. "They will come for you," the chief said simply. Holt nodded. "Always someone comes. The question's what they find when they get here." 2 weeks later, the hunters came, 5 of them, rough men from Fort Union with horses, rifles, and the company's coin behind them. They hit the camp before dawn, expecting easy pickings. They didn't count on Crow eyes in every shadow. When the first shot cracked, Holt rolled from his bedroll, snatched his rifle, and fired blind into the trees. The Crow answered with bows and war cries sharp as hawk screams. The air filled with smoke and sparks. Holt dragged one of his stoves from the lodge, tipped it, and stuffed it with dry grass and pine resin. "You want fire?" he growled. "I'll give you fire." He kicked it toward the attackers, and the draft caught. fast, sending a sheet of blue flame roaring up the slope. The mercenaries scattered like startled elk. When dawn came, 2 of them lay still. The others fled east, leaving horses and gear behind. Holt's shoulder was grazed, but he was alive. Red Elk clasped his arm. "Your fire protects our lodges, as it did your own. The mountain favors you." Holt looked at the wreckage, at the iron stove still smoking in the grass, and shook his head. "The mountain don't favor nobody, Chief. It just watches to see who learns." By winter's first snow, Holt knew he couldn't stay. The company would send more men, and he wouldn't bring that kind of war to those who'd sheltered him. He packed light again, leaving behind tools and iron enough for the Crow to build more sleeping fires. Red Elk gave him a token, a small piece of carved stone etched with a spiral of smoke. "Wherever you go," the chief said, "this will remind you that even fire has a home." Holt nodded. "And a price," he added softly. He crossed the Yellowstone before dawn, the river whispering under its thin skin of ice. Behind him, a thread of smoke rose from the Crow lodges, steady, straight, untouchable. He smiled at the sight. Maybe that was all a man could hope to leave behind, warmth for those who came after, and stories carried on the wind. The year was 1840, and the mountains were emptying. The beaver were gone, the great rendezvous of the Rockies had held its last dance, and the fur companies were folding their tents for good. Men who'd once fought bears with their bare hands were drifting back east or vanishing into the high country, ghosts chasing echoes of a wilder age. Ephraim Holt was one of those ghosts. He was older now, beard streaked with frost white, back bent from years under packs and winters. The world he'd known, the one made of traps, hides, and smoke, was dying around him. He could feel it each time he came down from the ridges and saw wagons rolling. Westward families, settlers, missionaries, all chasing their piece of what had once been the mountain men's kingdom. He didn't blame them, but the sight of them gnawed at something deep inside. Holt followed the Yellowstone south that spring, crossing into country he hadn't seen in years. The rivers were lower, the game fewer. Where once there'd been endless wilderness, now stood posts, cabins, and fences lines on a land that had never asked for them. One afternoon he found himself near the ruins of his old cabin on the Popo Agi, the Untouchable one. The roof had caved, the logs gone gray as ash. But when he kicked aside the moss, there lay the iron stove, half buried yet still whole. He squatted beside it and ran his fingers over the cold metal. "Still keepin' the fire, are you?" he murmured. "Reckon you outlasted the man who made you." A crow croaked from a pine branch. Holt looked up and smiled. The land remembered, even if people didn't. He camped there that night. As dusk fell, he set a small flame inside the stove, fed it with dry twigs until the flue hissed clean and sure. The warmth wrapped around him like an old friend. For the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of gunfire or howling wolves. He woke to the sound of hooves. A rider approached from the meadow, young, clean-shaven, wearing a city coat too fine for the wilderness. He dismounted awkwardly, tipping his hat. "Mr. Ephraim Holt?" he asked. Holt rose slow, leaning on his rifle. "Who's askin'?" "Name's Henry Gage," the stranger said. "My father was Hiram Gage American Fur Company. I've come a long way to find you." Holt spat into the grass. "If it's money you're after, son, I ain't got any. Never did." The young man smiled faintly. "Not money. History. I'm a writer. I've been collecting stories of the mountain men. Smith, Bridger, Beckworth, Carson, and yours came up again and again. The man who built the fire that couldn't be touched." "Stories grow like weeds," Holt said. "They ain't worth much picking." "But yours seems rooted in truth," Henry replied. "I've seen the remains of your stoves in Crow Country. Ingenious things. They still use them." Holt's eyes softened. "Do they now? Good. Better use than I ever made of them." Henry hesitated. "There's more. I've found records, letters, sketches suggesting your design was stolen, patented back east under another name. They're making cast-iron heaters now, selling them by the hundreds. Folks in New York and Philadelphia warm their parlors with your invention." Holt laughed, low and rough. "So the world's finally warm, is it? Then I done my part." The young man frowned. "Aren't you angry? They took what was yours. Holt poked at the embers with a stick. "Son, I took what was the mountains first. The warmth, the iron, the idea they all come from here. I just listened long enough to hear what the land was sayin'. If folks back east can't hear it for themselves, that's punishment enough." They sat together through the afternoon, and Holt told him what he remembered of Jedediah Smith and the Green River men, of the wolves in the stove, of the Crow and their sleeping fires. Henry wrote it all down, his pencil scratching like a cricket in the dust. When he finished, he said quietly, "These stories will be read. People will know what it took to live out here." Holt smiled. "Then tell it straight. Tell 'em we weren't heroes. Just men too stubborn to die." That night, Henry stayed in the ruined cabin. He watched the old man sleep beside the iron stove, one hand resting on his rifle as if he still expected the wilderness to test him. Before dawn, Holt stirred, eyes half open. "Gage," he said, voice like dry leaves. "If you ever write this down, don't make it about me. Make it about the fire." They parted at sunrise. Henry rode east, his notebook heavy with the story. Holt turned north, following the river again, the way he'd always gone when the world grew too crowded. His mule limped, his breath came short, but his stride never faltered. He traveled until the land turned wild again, where elk still moved like shadows, and the wind carried no fences. There, beneath a stand of aspen, he built a small lean-to and set the last of his iron pipe into the earth. He lit one more fire, and when the flue began to hum, he closed his eyes and listened. Some say a crow hunter found him weeks later, sitting upright, hands folded, the fire long since cooled. Others claim he walked into the timber and vanished, leaving only footprints that ended at the river's edge. Either way, the mountains kept his secret. Years later, when settlers pushed through that country, they found a curious thing, an iron pipe sticking from the ground, still drawing air, still clean of rust. They called it the spirit stove, and when they lit a twig, inside, the smoke rose straight and true, just as it had for Ephraim Holt. Henry Gage kept his word. He published Holt's story in a slim volume titled Men Who Built the West. Buried among tales of Bridger and Carson was one simple chapter, The Fire That Could Not Be Touched. It spoke of ingenuity, solitude, and the strange kind of faith it took to hammer civilization out of wilderness. Readers in the cities called it myth. But trappers, settlers, and even soldiers who wintered in the Rockies swore otherwise. They told of old cabins whose chimneys never smoked, of crow lodges that burned clean in midwinter, of iron stoves that hummed like a living thing. And always, somewhere in those tales, there was the whisper of a man who'd listened to the mountains until they spoke fire to him. Come spring, when the meltwater runs high and the cottonwoods bud, some travelers along the Popoague claim they still see a thread of smoke curling skyward from the ruins of an old cabin. No sound, no footprint, just that thin, perfect line, rising unbent through the wind. They say it's the mountain's way of remembering Ephraim Holt, the man who made fire serve rather than destroy, the man whose cabin and spirit remained forever untouchable. The wind never left the mountains, it only changed its song. By 1860, 20 years had passed since Ephraim Holt's last fire burned on the Popoague, and the frontier had shifted west like a restless tide. Where trappers once traded beaver pelts, now ran wagon trails and army posts. The wild world had thinned, but its memory still hung in the air, stubborn as pine smoke. It began, oddly enough, in Street Louis. The city that had once been the gateway to the west now glittered with gas lamps and iron bridges. In a small exhibit room off Market Street, the Hall of Western Curiosities, stood a soot-black stove. It was squat, wide-mouthed, and capped with a curious pipe that bent twice before disappearing through the post wall. Visitors admired it for its simplicity. A sign beneath read, Holt Stove, circa 1830. Design attributed to Ephraim Holt, mountain man and inventor. Said to burn clean and steady, impervious to wind, recovered from the ruins of a cabin near the Wind River Range. Most passed it by with little notice. But one evening a man lingered long after the crowd had gone. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused and his coat still smelling faintly of horses. His name was Tom Holt, Ephraim's grandson. He'd grown up on the edge of Missouri, where his father, Ephraim's son, had told him tales by the fire. Stories of storms that couldn't snuff a flame, of wolves that turned away from iron, and of a cabin that outlasted the man who built it. Tom never believed all of it, but standing there before that blackened stove, he felt something stir in his chest. He reached out, touched the cold metal. It hummed faintly under his hand. The museum keeper looked up from his desk. "Fine piece, ain't it? Came down from the mountains about 15 years back. They say it's still got a draft through it, even shut up indoors." Tom nodded. "Aye," he said softly. "It would." That night Tom walked along the levee, listening to the Mississippi slap against the pilings. He thought of his grandfather alone up there in the wild, building something the world had stolen and renamed. They warmed their parlors with his fire, Henry Gage had written. But what had the mountain kept? Tom decided then that he'd find out. He sold his wagon stock that spring and headed west with nothing but a mule, a pick, and an iron pot he'd fashioned after the stove in St. Louis. His trail led through Kansas, across the Platte, and into the high country his grandfather once roamed. It took months, but by late August he found himself in sight of the Wind Rivers jagged and blue, rising out of sagebrush like the bones of the earth. There, on the Popo Aggie, he found the ruin. Time had done its work. The roof gone, the logs sunken, the stove half buried in silt. Yet the chimney pipe still stood straight, whispering faintly as if the air itself remembered how to breathe through it. Tom knelt beside it, brushing away the soil until the iron gleamed dull red in the sunset. "Grandfather," he said quietly, "you left your fire here." He built a small camp and stayed for a week. Each night he gathered wood, tested the airflow through the pipe, and studied the angles of the old design. By the 5th day he had his own prototype, a stove fashioned from scavenged iron, shaped with the same bent flue and side draft openings that Ephraim had once invented. When he lit it, the flame burned clean and steady, no smoke, no flicker. He sat up all night watching it. When the dawn came, he knew what he'd do. In 1862, Tom Holt returned to Street. Lewis not as a trapper, but as a smith. He took up a small shop near the riverfront, stamping the name Holt, Ironworks, on the door. Folks thought he was just another tinker, but those who bought his stoves learned different. His models burned hotter, cleaner, and safer than anything on the market. Soldiers on the frontier used them in tents. Settlers hauled them west in wagons. Some even found their way into steamboats plying the Missouri. When asked his secret, Tom would only say, "Good air makes a good fire. My grandfather taught me that." Business grew slow but steady. By the late 1862, he'd earned modest renown across the territories. But Tom wasn't driven by profit, he was chasing a ghost. He sent one of his first stoves to the Museum of the Mountain Man, newly opened in Wyoming Territory, engraved with the words, "To the memory of Ephraim Holt, who listened to the mountains until they spoke fire to him." Years later, in 1873, an elderly man arrived at Tom's forge. He wore a city coat and spectacles, his hair white as cotton. Tom looked up from the anvil and blinked. "Mr. Gage?" The man smiled. "Aye. You've your grandfather's eyes." Henry Gage had spent the decades writing histories, lecturing on the fur trade, and collecting tales of the old days. But he had come west this time for a single reason: to see the line of Holt's fire still burning. Together they went to the back of the shop where Tom's latest design stood glowing. Henry crouched beside it, hand trembling. "It breathes just the same," he said. "Clean and true." Tom nodded. "I figured as much. Mountain wind don't change. Only men do." Henry looked up, eyes shining. "Do you know your grandfather's name has found its way into the journals now? The Smithsonian has begun to collect pieces from the fur trade. Your stove may stand beside Bridger's rifle one day." Tom chuckled. "He'd hate that. Man never much cared for fame." Henry leaned closer. "Then we'll call it what it is, a legacy. A fire that couldn't be touched, passed from one hand to the next." They sat in silence after that, listening to the stove hum. Outside, the evening bells of St. Louis rang across the river, mingling with the low hiss of iron-breathing flame. Before he died, Tom Holt left behind a small notebook of sketches, designs, airflow studies, and a handful of journal pages. The final entry read, "Grandfather said the mountains speak if you listen long enough. I believe him now. This stove ain't invention, it's translation. The wind wanted a home, the fire wanted a tongue. Ephraim gave them both." After his passing, the shop closed, but his stoves endured, still found decades later in ranch houses, forts, and line cabins across the high plains. The men who used them never knew the full story, but they'd say, with quiet respect, that a Holt stove never failed and never smoked. In time, even the name faded. Yet in the far valleys of Wyoming, beneath aspen and snowmelt, old hunters still tell a story by the fire of a man who made heat stand against the storm, of a sun who carried that heat into a changing world, of a fire that learned to breathe like a mountain. And when the night grows deep and the wind slips through the timber, some swear they hear a low hum, steady, calm, and untouchable, like air drawn through an iron pipe still working after 100 winters. By the 1,870 seconds, the West was no longer the silent, untamed world Ephraim Holt had known. Iron rails crossed the plains where buffalo once thundered. The whistle of locomotives echoed through canyons that had only known wolves and wind. But if the land had changed, its hunger for heat, its need for the fire that could not be touched, remained the same. And so the Holt name, though half forgotten, began to rise again. In the spring of 1875, a blacksmith named Samuel Rusk rode into Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. He was a thick-armed Pennsylvanian who'd come west with the Union Pacific cruise. Years spent working blast furnaces in Pittsburgh had hardened him, but the mountain air softened his temper. He'd heard stories from a retired engineer about a strange stove used by fur trappers, burns without smoke, drafts against the wind, they said. When Rusk saw one of Tom Holt's old iron stoves in a ranch house outside Laramie, he crouched beside it and stared. The pipes bent in curious angles, the seams double-riveted, the airflow so precise that the fire burned blue at the core. It was no ordinary stove, it was engineering born from instinct, not schooling. "Who built it?" Rusk asked. "Some trapper's kin," the rancher replied. "Name was Holt, I reckon. Been burnin' near 30 years now. Never smoked once." Rusk ran a hand across the warm iron. "Then this Holt fella was a genius. He bought the stove outright for $20 and packed it onto a wagon bound for the Union Pacific Foundry in Omaha. There, he spent weeks dismantling and studying every inch of its flue, every turn of its pipe. What, he discovered, would change the frontier's relationship with heat. By winter's first snow, Rusk had built a larger model, a furnace rather than a stove. Using Holt's same side draft principle, he created a blast system that burned half the coal and produced twice the heat. It could smelt iron faster and cleaner than anything west of the Mississippi. The railroad men were stunned. The design was patented in 1876 under the name Rusk Holt Furnace. Rusk had insisted on including the mountain man's name after finding Henry Gage's old pamphlet, The Fire That Could Not Be Touched, in a second-hand shop. "No man should steal a flame he didn't light," he said.